Hello Misfits and welcome. In today's video, we're going to talk all about maps. I'm talking those gridded maps that we put our tokens on when we play Pathfinder or D&D or whichever game you prefer. And before we get into the video itself, I know it's kind of weird that I'm putting one of these out on a Friday instead of a Tuesday. My tip video schedule has been all out of sorts, so I apologize for that. I'm kind of working on maybe sort of building up a back catalog of these so I can get that upload schedule to be just a little bit more regular. But also we just didn't have a campaign video to put out, so I figured I'd go on and roll one of these out, get a chance to chat and give you an update on things going on. So that's why. Also, in case you missed it, I made a song. Me and my friend Sarah made a song. She wrote all the lyrics, I read them, and I set them to music, and then we filmed like a crazy music video. If you haven't gone and checked that out, please go and do so. If that video gets enough sort of support and acknowledgement, etc., then I will consider putting that song up on some place like Spotify or Apple Music so that anybody can go listen to it. So please go check that out. It was a lot of fun to make, and I have so many stories to tell about it, but that's not what we're talking about today. So let's just get into maps. So basically, I want to talk about if you need maps, what you might need them for, and when you need to prepare those in advance. And I know that this is sort of like a very basic thing, but when I was first starting out as a dungeon master, I just really didn't know when I needed to have some sort of map prepared. There were the maps and stuff for locations in the published module that I ran as my first ever campaign, but sometimes we had maps for locations where there wasn't really anything going on, there wasn't a fight that was going to break out. Sometimes we didn't have maps for some locations where there definitely was an opportunity for combat or exploration or things like that. So I was often confused about when I needed maps, if I needed to supply additional maps for certain scenarios or locations. If I didn't, I was so confused and I didn't really have a reliable way of finding out what was expected or what was done. So this is me providing that for you if you happen to be a newer GM or DM. So first, do you even need a map? We just talked about how, those published modules, they don't always give us maps when we need them, or sometimes they give us maps when we don't need them. And then if you're doing a homebrew campaign, nobody is supplying you with maps. It's your responsibility to go get those yourself. So, do you even need them? No, you actually don't. Many tables and many gaming systems will rely heavily and sometimes solely on something called theater of the mind. That means that instead of having a physical thing to look at or a physical representation, it's all in your head, it's all in your mind, and really your only limitation is your own imagination. There is actually a pretty good argument to be made about really doing everything as theater of the mind. Because when somebody hands us a map of a location, like a gridded map to represent the place that you're in, you suddenly think, or a lot of people will suddenly come to think, that what's on that map is what is there. And that is it. There's no sort of wiggle room. Everything in that location is represented in that picture on that map. And that's not always the case. A lot of these maps won't show things like the various rocks and stones along the forest path, or the ropes holding the chandeliers aloft in the banquet hall. And so we might not even think to factor those into our characters' decisions. If we are doing theater of the mind, we might think about those things, or at least have the opportunity to imagine them. And so when you're in the midst of combat, instead of just fighting each other until it's over, you could throw in some improvised weapons, or cut that rope holding up the chandelier and drop it on your enemy, or use it to swing from one side of the room to the other. You have a little bit more to play with because you're not limited by this visual representation that's kind of cutting you off from all these different things that might be there. It's great to use theater of the mind. It sort of opens up a lot of doors, but I can see why some tables might want to limit how much they use that. It might only happen in roleplay scenarios, but not really in combat. And a lot of times that's because in combat, there's a lot to keep track of. You're trying to keep track of how far you are from your enemies, how close you are to your allies, where all the exits are, if you're up high or down low, if there's levels that we're dealing with. And that can be a lot to just keep all in your head. And especially if you're newer to the game, you might really struggle with imagining all these different things. And it might be easier to have a map or a physical representation of what's going on. So there's nothing wrong with using physical maps, but just know that it's not the only option. So now let's talk about what those maps are for. When do we use maps? When do we roll out a map? Well, for me, in my games, there's really two big reasons why I might roll out a gridded map. And number one is going to be for combat, fighting each other. And number two is going to be for exploration. So, yeah, if you're fighting a enemy or multiple enemies, it's generally good to have some sort of map to roll out, especially if you're dealing with sort of an interesting room or location with various rooms, or even if you're just dealing with multiple enemies, it's good to know how far you are away from them. So I generally will use a gridded map for combat encounters, but sometimes I use them for exploration, like exploring a dungeon or a mansion or places like that, especially if it's a place that has traps that are connected to specific floor tiles or specific rooms. Or if I know that taking a certain route will lead to some sort of combat encounter or things like that. You don't need a gridded map for, every dungeon or things like that, but they can be good to have. But those are generally my two reasons why I might roll out a gridded map. I'm sure there are others. I can think of other scenarios in which I have rolled out maps, but generally that's what I use them for. But when do you need to have these prepared in advance? Because in my mind, there's kind of two different types of maps here. There's the maps that you prepare in advance that might have extra details thrown on, walls, passageways, certain objects, things like that. Or if you're playing virtually, using those pretty maps that have been drawn by yourself or somebody on Patreon or things like that. And then there's kind of the maps that we throw up last minute, like just a blank grid or a very, very generic location. So those prepared maps that are a little bit more detailed and take a little bit more time to set up, you're going to want to have those made in advance. And typically you're going to want to make those if you know that they are going to that location where the map applies to, or if you know that they are going to face an encounter or have a high likelihood of facing an encounter. Let's say in a session, I know that my party plans to go infiltrate the bandit hideout and take out their leader. Now, there are certainly scenarios in which they talk their way out of fights and sneak their way in and avoid detection or smooth things over so that nobody has to fight anybody. But I will generally prepare the maps for the bandit hideout and their potential face-off against the bandit leader just in case, because I know there's a high chance of that happening. Or let's say I know that they plan to go attack a dragon in its lair. I'm going to prepare a map for that dragon lair and have that dragon token ready because I know that that's where they're headed. Yeah, if I know that there's a dungeon that they're going to be exploring because it's in their main quest line that they're following, I will prepare a map or maps for that dungeon. But there are plenty of scenarios where I'm not going to prepare a map. And these are like random fights that I can't prepare for or predict or account for. The rogue decides to steal something from a merchant in town. A guard sees them. Suddenly there's a combat encounter in the street. I don't have that prepared because that was a spur-of-the-moment decision by my players that led to an encounter. So I don't have like a map prepared for that. So there are certainly different scenarios. We've got our prepared stuff, and that's normally for your bigger encounters, bigger moments within the story and the quests. And then there's the sort of pop-up events that you don't plan for. For those pop-up events, you can either throw down a blank grid, or if you're playing virtually, throw up a blank grid that doesn't have any details on it. Or something that I do is I just keep just like a generic map handy for really basic locations. In Roll20, I have just sort of like a generic 4x4 grid of like a desert, a forest, a swamp, and like a snowy landscape. And so they're really, really basic. I don't use them often, but if something random pops up, I can just throw that out there so that we have some sort of like nice backdrop to look at. But when it comes to those more significant encounters and dungeons and things like that, I've taken the time to prepare that ahead of time. You never want to be drawing those or preparing those mid-session because they take time. All of these maps take time, and that's why you don't want to map for every single location and every single scene or event, because even just the active switching maps can take up time and it can slow down the pacing of your story. You know, they are chasing after some guy and race into town running after him. If you then stop and pull up your map of the town, instead of just doing like a theater of the mind chase sequence, then you're kind of stopping the action there and stopping the tension. You kind of just want to keep it going, if that makes sense. Now, I mean, if you really, really enjoy having tons of maps and it's not an issue for you to prepare those in advance, and you and your players like that and that works for you, go for it. You know, this is just my advice and what I would recommend, but we're all different. If you would prefer to not have any maps at all, go for that as well. Find out what works for you. Find out how many things you need to prepare in advance and how many things you can get away with kind of just winging it or not having stuff prepared for. You're gonna have to learn that balance on your own with time and practice. It's certainly not going to be something you just know immediately. Nobody's going to be able to tell you how much preparation you need for your session. Only you can figure out that on your own. But yeah, this was my video about maps. When I was a first-time DM, I really, really struggled with when I needed maps. I kid you not, I prepared a map for the entire town of Vallaki in Curse of Strahd. And we did a chase sequence, and I made my players, like, move their tokens across this ginormous map to race through town. And it was so unnecessary. It slowed things down. It took so much time. I just didn't understand yet. And I realize now, in hindsight, that I didn't need that at all. But nobody told me, and I wouldn't have learned that if I hadn't have tried it out on my own. And there were certainly maps that I prepared that weren't in the book that I needed. I came up with some new encounters to throw at my party and needed to create maps for those. And then there were maps that they gave us that we didn't even need because they either avoided the location or it wasn't a hostile environment. Like, they give you a map for Madame Ava's camp, but you probably don't even need it because you're probably not going to be fighting anybody there. Or maybe you are. It depends. It depends on how you play out the story. But yeah, this was just sort of my advice on that whole side of things. Because I know newer game masters and dungeon masters, like, there's just so much that we don't know and we aren't told and isn't like specifically written out in the DMG, because the DMG is a very frustrating book that isn't very beginner friendly. So this is me hopefully imparting some of my wisdom that I've gained over the years onto you so that you can have a smoother experience as a first-time game master. Anyway, I hope this was useful to you. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe. That stuff really, really helps me out. But more importantly, leave a comment down below. Tell me about times when you prepared maps that didn't get used, or didn't have a map prepared that you really needed. Or maybe tell me about times or scenarios in which you think you should have a map that I didn't mention. We talked about exploration and like combat encounters, but is there something else that maybe we need a map for that I didn't think about or didn't say? Just let me know in the comments below. But with all of that said and done, I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend and a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you again next time. Oh my gosh, I just want to talk about that music video that I made. One, it was so much fun. It was incredibly fun, and it's something I've been working on for a while. I think she gave me the lyrics, like, gosh, in February or maybe even January. It was a while ago, and I very, very quickly set it to music, but we filmed the first stuff. The pirate stuff was filmed first. That happened in March. And then it was like almost another full month before we filmed any of the other stuff. But I have a lot of really silly stories from that whole experience. And I also have a lot of outtakes and bloopers and alternative shots from all of that. And I'm kind of thinking of putting that together into like a blooper reel or something. So if that seems like something that would be interesting to you, let me know, and I will expedite the process of getting that done. Anyway, so I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you guys that have watched the music video enjoyed it, and if you haven't watched it, please go watch it. And yeah, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.